same is true when we talk about Thomas Sankara and other African revolutionaries. The assassination of their life was not the first instance that was attempted against them. But we also know that even some of the other folks who lost their lives in quote unquote other ways, Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture, Sekou Toure, France Fanon, who are the four that we're going to focus on in today's episode, uh, before they met their demise, there were previous instances where their lives were in danger. So there wasn't, like nothing ever happened to them and then they just died from this health concern. So that's why we're going to talk about this subject. So we're glad that you're here to join us for that. And we, of course, give honor and respect to the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere and our African ancestors, who are the only reason why we are here breathing and able to continue this struggle. So we just start, as we always do, by just going through the brief introductions. Our Ancestors' Voices. This program is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party, AAPRP. And the AAPRP is a revolutionary, independent, mass, Pan-African political party which has its base in Africa, the national home for all people of African descent scattered in suffering in almost 120 countries worldwide. And our objective to address that suffering is Pan-Africanism, which we define correctly as the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, or in a shorter version, one unified socialist Africa. That's our solution. We believe that until that solution is achieved, we will never, as a people anywhere on earth, have true freedom, self-determination, and dignity. That's the missing piece. No matter where we are, what language we speak, what faith we practice, what foods we eat, what dances we do, regardless of all of those things, how we do them the same, how we do them differently, until Africa is free, united, and socialist, we will never achieve our freedom, dignity, and self-determination. And so our work to achieve Pan-Africanism is outlined in Kwame Nkrumah's book, The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, the cover, which is on the screen here. And Nkrumah, of course, is the original visionary for the creation of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, from his experiences as the first head of state for Ghana, which was the first independent country in Africa. And once the Central Intelligence Agency led an effort to overthrow his government 9 years after it was instituted, he was, of course, in Guinea under the protection of the Democratic Party of Guinea and Sekou Toure. And it was there that he crystallized his perspective of what would be necessary to bring about the African Revolution and to guide it to success. So that's what our strategy is about, uniting all of the revolutionary Pan-African formations on the ground that agree that Pan-Africanism is one unified socialist Africa. Because people that are not in organizations, you ask them what Pan-Africanism is, they'll tell you some of anything. If they're not in a Pan-African political party, they'll tell you all kinds of stuff. But Pan-Africanism is Black people united. Like, what does that mean? I mean, that's really nebulous to me. That doesn't really mean anything. I'm united with you because our skin color is the same hue. I don't know anything about your values. Like, that has never made any sense to me. That's why we say there has to be a nation, class, and gender component to our analysis. It can't just be a race analysis. It can't just be a class analysis. It can't just be a gender analysis. It has to be all of those. And so that's why we say one unified socialist Africa, and we have the strategy we have. And this program, Our Ancestors' Voices, is hosted each week by myself, Ajamu, and my biological, ideological daughter, the newly anointed Dr. Shakur Umi. So to get us started, I turn it over to her.
Hello, thank you, Baba John. Appreciate you. What's going on, good people? Good to have you all with us. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important topic. So we are really humbled to come to you today. And I think it's important to always continue to reflect and to shed light on the enemy that we are up against and what our tactics have been throughout time, because our ancestors have always paved the way and, left trails and breadcrumbs for us to follow. But this is why we have to increase our political education to learn and understand what exactly those particular communicative approaches have been from past ancestors who have been murdered and taken from us, probably way before their time probably would have come for them to pass on. And so, the best way for you to tackle any type of issue in your life, I'm sure people will agree, is first you need to understand what it is you're up against. You're not going to be able to eradicate capitalism or imperialism if you don't even understand what those entities are. You may not even know that those are systems. So, first, we need to kind of define what imperialism is, and then we can start to understand how it operates, how it functions, and more importantly, why this is a threat to us as a systematic way of ensuring oppression, dehumanization, and ultimately brutality and mortality, right? So when we think about imperialism, this is an international system where a dominant country steals resources from another country, right? So this dominant country is in a position to take these resources from somewhere else because of their power, because of their dominance, right? And so, of course, now this must rely on the political destabilization. So, again, maintaining its dominance because it's able to break down that other country's politics, political structures, political views, whatever you may have, breaking that down, taking that down and uncentering it, destabilizing it. This also falls into the assassination to ensure the face of leadership in the exploited countries reflects the interest of imperialism. And that is why we hope you are with us today, because none of these faces that you see had any intention of reflecting imperialism. And for that, this is why we will always respect and pay homage to these comrades. We will always acknowledge and say their names. We will always remember them. We will celebrate them. We will congratulate the fact that we are trying to do even an ounce of the work that they did in their entire lives. We are trying our best to do it and to duplicate it and to allow for the world to be better because of it. But none of these comrades had any interest in representing imperialism. None of them had any motivation to represent imperialism. And so, again, when you think about imperialism, remember, if you're going to take over a country's political well being and their resources, you have to take out people who are pushing against your agenda. You can't leave them alone and leave them alive because they are going to threaten your ability to be powerful and to maintain your power dominance. So this is why these comrades had to go, because they represented leadership that was in the opposite interest of imperialism, which meant that dominant country wouldn't be in a position to continue to maintain the control, to continue to get the resources, to get any resources at all. So this is why they were targeted and this is why they were assassinated. And since revolutionaries exist to combat imperialism, this backward system has perfected the concept of assassinating leaders to the point where this is a common thing every single day, no matter what. And we see this taking place, I would argue, on several different levels, where basically if you see someone who can help organize the masses of people, if you see someone who can help enhance and enlighten them, if you see someone who has the power to change people's perceptions and to potentially encourage and persuade them to try a new thing, to adopt new methods, to start to read more, to start to politically educate themselves, whatever that can be, this backward system perfected the concept where those folks got to go because they are promoting the false kind of leadership that is not going to be well for imperialism. It is not going to yield well for imperialistic success or values. Some overtly and aggressively were murdered because they could not continue to exist in the current fashion that they were existing in. Others covertly and more subtle ways. And we can see that most of these African revolutionaries were overtly assassinated by imperialism and are names we all know as assassination victims. We have Samora Machel, we have Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Steve Biko, Amilcar Cabral, Malcolm X, and Fred Hampton. And so as we move to the next slide, we also want to encourage you all to continue to think not just about the ancestors that we are reflecting on today and how, we're so thankful and humbled and proud that they have had no issue at all standing on principle, standing, with all 10 toes in and being so brave and courageous. We are so thankful and humbled that they have intentionally set this lineage so that we could descend from them and that we could have that same courage running through our veins. But we also want to encourage you all again, like these comrades had every opportunity to back down. They had every opportunity to sell out. They had every opportunity to leave the country. They had every opportunity to stop the work that they were doing. They have every opportunity to consider a new approach and adopt a more patriotic way of living so that they wouldn't have to be a threat to imperialism anymore. And you can read some of the books that they left. You can listen to some of the audiobooks. You can watch the interviews on YouTube. You can continue to watch the seminars that we're providing, or the podcasts, or the other forms of media that we are providing as an organization when we talk about these folks. But the bottom line, as Baba Ajamu pointed out, a lot of these folks were getting death threats before they unfortunately took their last breath. They were already getting death threats. These folks had their houses bombed. These folks on their families almost died countless times, getting phone calls, threatening by phone call, threats by mail threats, right? So we have these different interactions where we start to see that because they have always lived on principle, they have basically always been targeted. And I guess the question we want to ask you all is, how much more bigger than yourself do you see this really being? Because at the end of the day, if you're scared of having something happen to you, that's understandable. But I guess I'm asking us to think about these comrades that we mentioned: Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara. What if they had all decided that they were scared? What if they had all decided that they didn't want to fight against colonialism in the countries of Africa that still have an impact on how African people are treated today? What if they had decided they didn't want to take patriarchal, anti-patriarchal approaches? What if they had decided that they didn't want to continue to unite Africa? What if Malcolm had never decided to go home to the continent and had never been able to come back and talk about his experiences there and how it shaped him and how he started to see connections between the default and the disparities of Africans in the Mid-South and the default and the disparities of Africans all around the world? What if none of these folks had decided that they wanted to be brave and to stand for something? What if none of them had decided that? You and I would not be in the positions that we're in today. We would not have the privileges that we have today. And I guess I'm speaking more to our intellectual privileges, but we probably wouldn't have physical privileges. We probably wouldn't have emotional privileges. We probably wouldn't have the bandwidth that we have. We wouldn't have the tenacity and the audacity. We wouldn't have the encouragement. We wouldn't have the motivation. We wouldn't have the pride that we feel. We wouldn't have the consciousness that it is bigger than us. We wouldn't have that. And thanks to Kwame Ture, we wouldn't understand that because it's bigger than us, and thanks to Malcolm X, and thanks to Martin Luther King, this is why not only do we need to fight for our own advocacy, our own autonomy, our own decency, but thanks to Kwame Ture in particular, now we're in a position, thinking of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where we're in a position where we understand it's not even just our own struggle. We need to help any marginalized group. So that means queer identifying individuals. We need to help differently abled individuals. We need to help anybody who is experiencing oppression just because they happen to appear to be different. That is on us, you all. That is on us. It's on us to recognize it. It's on us to reflect. It's on us to take the baton from Kwame Ture. That is on us. We cannot be subservient and self-righteous. We have to understand that we have a bigger principle picture here. We have to understand that. Because if they had not understood that, just think of how much farther back we'd be. Think of how much less progressive we could have been today if all these comrades that were listed before, and even some that we haven't mentioned yet, had all decided not to sacrifice because they knew that it was bigger than them. Just think about that. And it's going to be hard for you to think about what that could have been because you'll never know. You know why? Because they did sacrifice for us, because they did put their families on the line, because they put themselves on the line, because they believed in our people, because they believed that our people could be great, and they believed that our people deserve better, and they believed that we should believe that we deserve better. They believed that we believe that we deserve better. I hope you heard me the second time. So this means that this is bigger than us, and we have a responsibility. That means that their legacy complete is not complete until we all understand what our responsibility is to continue to push our own agenda forward, where we understand that we have a responsibility to help anyone who's experiencing oppression. Imperialism uses multiple approaches. The system most widely used and effective disinformation tool is the reactionary propaganda. This is why you have to know your history or your herstory or your their story. You have got to know what is being kept from you. You have got to seek information that is withheld from you on purpose because the intention is to maintain your ignorance. So you have got to look beyond that and you have got to seek what you don't know. And I know that doesn't make sense, but it will the more you start to increase your political education. You will find you're going down so many rabbit holes and how stimulating and how educating it is to do so. Capitalism, imperialism knows that most people do not study history. They know that. They're counting on that. That's what I said. It's so much more sexier to be ignorant, which is crazy because in any other circumstance, it would not be attractive to be ignorant. That would not be feasible. That would not be useful, right? They know that with the repeated effort, they can convince people to believe the positions they advance, regardless of the lack of evidence and or the knowledge to support their dishonest charges against genuine revolutionary work. But when those tactics fail to succeed, imperialism can and always does rely on political assassination. So, excuse me, if imperialism is not reaching success when it comes to using ways to bring lack of integrity into the work that we're doing to try to reduce our credibility and to try to enhance our dishonesty or our inhumanity. When those tactics don't work, imperialism has a successful, consistent one where all it does is just rely on the political assassination. And a lot of that is by attacking character. A lot of that is by attacking integrity. A lot of that is by attacking the community. A lot of it is by attacking the organization's character or the organization's reliability, whatever that looks like, so that you can find a thread somewhere that is rattled. And then after you find that rattled thread, all you have to do is pull on it because now it has already showed you that its integrity is compromised. And now you have everything you need to continue to manipulate that and to continue to push it for what you want it to be. So, we just want to focus on some of the images that we see on the left here. So these are some of the world's most notorious international espionage agencies. And so, of course, we have the CIA, we have Mossad, we have M16, KGB. On the bottom left, we have FSB, ISA, NSA, and then we have Abwehr. I'm not doing well with that. But yes, these are some of the world's most notorious international espionage agencies. So all in all, you all, we're asking you to think of two things before I pass it back to Baba Jabu. Of course, why did these comrades, why did these ancestors, why were they so interested in showing up for humanity and for showing up for African people to the point where they sacrificed for us? What is it that they felt they could gain? And more importantly, what is it that they felt we could gain by them giving us their life for the work that they were doing and for the fact that they had no intentions of stopping that work, the fact that they knew that they wanted to resist imperialism and because of that, they were targets. But the second thing is we're asking you to think more about where that leaves you. Where does that leave you in terms of this work that still needs to be done? And in terms of you understanding that if you're not in a position to help us because you're not increasing your political education, then what other ways can you help us do this work? If you don't want to resist the imperialist agenda, then how else can you support that? Can you support a Pan-Africanist organization? Can you donate books? Can you donate money for books? Can you donate resources? Can you help us make flyers? Can you drive comrades who can't make it to meetings? Can you give us your gas? Like, what can you do to support us? Because this is on all of us at the end of the day. And at the end of the moment, you can't say, well, organizers still didn't do nothing. And that's why we can't organize as a people when you're not standing on principle to even say that. That's simply not true. And the last thing we need to do is spew out more lies. So consider how you can contribute. If you're tired of the situation being what it is, what are you willing to do to fix it? And how does it benefit the masses of people?
Ashe, obrigada, asante sana, midasi. So I want to talk about why would imperialism utilize subtle assassinations? In other words, why wouldn't they just overtly just murder everybody that they disagreed with? Why would they use other tactics that were more subtle, like poisoning people or doing things to make people gradually develop poor health that would eventually kill them? Why would they even bother with those tactics, right? And I think the answer, it's important to understand for us that when imperialism assassinates a revolutionary, they're doing that for strategic imperatives. In other words, if the political conditions permit them to murder a leader or someone who's perceived as someone who has people who look to them for direction, and if they can do that in a way that makes it look otherwise, then why wouldn't they do that? Because when they politically murder someone, when they just shoot and kill someone or car bomb someone or do those types of things, those types of tactics can potentially backfire in the sense that they could inspire people. It could create a martyrdom complex, right? The person who's assassinated becomes a martyr, and that could precipitate a lot of people getting involved in the struggle, whereas before they probably would not have done that if that incident had not happened. So if they can get rid of somebody and make it look different, obviously people's if they look up to someone and that person is shot and killed, their reaction to that is going to be different than if they look up to someone and the person chokes on some meat and dies, or if they get COVID and die, or if they get cancer and die. They're going to look at that differently. They most likely won't see it the same way. They won't see it as a direct attack on them as they would when the person is shot and killed or blown up. And if they don't see it like that, the chances of them seeing the assassination as an impetus for them to step up their involvement in the struggle, it may happen, but most likely it won't. So that's the reason why, uh, that's a logical reason why imperialism would engage in subtle tactics to assassinate someone. We've talked before about how the broader perspective of the strategic imperialism, or that they do so much work, as Shakur briefly alluded to discredit the work. They do that by telling lies. Like if you look at like the Cuban Revolution, for example, they talk about what's a dictatorship. The people don't have any rights in Cuba. They're denied human rights. They pump that constantly, constantly, constantly. And everyone who even I'm talking about even these people who go to Cuba just for tourist reasons that don't even know anything about the Cuban Revolution. Even those people that just surface level analysis. They just go in there because of the beaches and the bars and stuff. They don't even know anything about the history of the revolution. Even those people come back from those tourist visits and say, yeah, I think that we've been lied to about what's happening in Cuba. Now, obviously, if those people come to that level of consciousness, the people who are engaged in organized struggle against imperialism and have studied the Cuban Revolution extensively come back with a clear ability to analyze how the people have freedom under the Cuban Revolution, how they exercise that freedom, just essentially dismantling the lies that are being told about the Cuban Revolution. But imperialism has to make that effort of misinformation because, like we just said, like they know people don't study. So they know if they tell a lie and dress it up well enough, the chances are very, and tell it often enough, the chances are very good that the majority of people are going to accept that at face value. They do that consistently. That's a tactic they use. They said in 1970, I mentioned this before, Kwame Ture, when he was Stokely Carmichael, he was subpoenaed to come testify before the House of Un-American Activities. They used to call it HUAC. And what HUAC was, it was a Senate committee in the U.S. legislature, and they were on a communist witch hunt. So anybody that they wanted to accuse of being a communist or, a radical leftist, then they would bring them there. They would, engage in all these activities designed to bring that person or persons down. They would put pressure on their employer to terminate them. They would put pressure on the banks where these folks had loans to, figure out a way to legally, at least appear legally, to break the mortgage on the people's houses. They would put pressure on people not to rent to them, all of these things. This was all a part of their, and it was designed to demoralize people who were engaged in the struggle, right? To frame people, to accuse them of committing crimes they didn't commit. They did all of these things, right? That's kind of stuff they did to try to discredit, to accuse people of doing things that they didn't do. Like in the case of Fred Hampton, they accused him of stealing $71 worth of ice cream from an ice cream truck. And they put him in they arrested him, convicted him, and put him in prison for that, when clearly, there was no evidence that he had done that. But this is the kind of stuff they do, hoping that it would discredit Fred Hampton and the Illinois Black Panther Party, who was engaged in some of the best revolutionary organizing work this country's ever seen. And because that tactic did not work, it didn't discredit Fred. Instead, it enhanced his status among the people. Then, eventually they moved to out and out political murder of Fred Hampton. And in that case, I mean, they did it in a way where they didn't even bother to use surrogates like they normally do. The Chicago police carried out the assassination themselves. That tells you how desperate they were to get rid of him. But it didn't just start with them breaking into his apartment, poisoning him, or I'm sorry, drugging him and breaking into his apartment on December 4th, 1969 at 4 a.m. They had been engaged, as I just mentioned, with acts to discredit him long before that. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago the FBI file, or last week, the FBI file that was created to attempt to discredit Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to paint him as an adulterer, as someone who had loose moral values and therefore could not be looked upon as a moral voice in the country. And they made that attempt, and that attempt failed. His wife refused to take the bait when they sent her the package. The media outlets that they sent the package to refused to take the bait. And so, of course, eventually he was violently murdered, right? That was the case. We talked about El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, and how he was poisoned on December 3rd, 1964, in Cairo, Egypt, where the doctors there who had no political consciousness, they weren't revolutionary doctors, they weren't in the Cuban Revolution or in Vietnam or China or anywhere like that at that time. They were just doctors in Egypt who had gone to medical school to become doctors and make a lot of money, and they happened to have him as a patient, and they were the ones that said that he had a toxic element in his stomach that they pumped out, that it wasn't just, a common sickness or a flu bug or anything of that nature, that it was a chemical toxin that was uh, invasive to his body that somebody gave him. They said that. So that's documented. That's not an opinion. That happened. But that didn't work. He was not discredited that way, and eventually they engaged in a violent assassination to take his life. We could go on down the line. There were several efforts to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. First, he was discredited the same way the example I'm giving you of all these other revolutionaries. If you didn't know, Patrice Lumumba was a postal worker. He worked at the post office in uh, um, in the Congo, in Leopoldville. He was a postal worker there, and he was accused of inappropriate usage of money, and he actually went to jail for that in the Congo. And so this was long before his political activism crystallized. And by the time he became prime minister, democratically elected prime minister of the Congo in 1960, these incidents were years behind him, right? When he was a very young man of like 2021, he was 35 by the time he became prime minister. But imperialism resurfaced these allegations to attempt to discredit him to the people. And of course, that didn't work. And so they eventually led to the, very complex conditions that led to him being violently murdered. Ernesto Che Guevara, another example. There were several efforts to discredit Che Guevara before he was eventually assassinated in Bolivia. Of course, he was assassinated in a combatant situation, so that's different. But still, the efforts were made to discredit, to destroy his reputation. And those efforts against him continue because once they murdered him, he became, as you know, an international icon for socialism and anti colonialism and liberation, of which he remains to this day you know, uh, uh, almost 60 years after he was assassinated, 58 years after he was assassinated, he's still an international icon. And so the efforts to discredit him, they go back to that. They're still attempting to discredit him. He was uh, a racist. He was this and that, all this stuff they use. So this is what they do, right? But they do that because if they can make things look like the people they wanted to have removed should be removed because they weren't qualified or committed to the people, then they'll do that, right? And the same with Libya. They did. I forgot to on the fly mention Muammar Gaddafi, who's in the first picture, but they did the same thing with him. I mean, there were years of efforts to discredit him and the Libyan Jamahiriya and what they did in Africa. And we'll talk extensively about that next week. That's the program topic next week. But the point is, there's always efforts to discredit the revolutionaries before they move to assassination, you know. But in some instances, a more subtle approach is deemed to be a better approach than out and out violent assassination. Maybe it's because the violent assassination is deemed as a last resort and maybe it's because of the circumstances that people or persons are in. Another method to assassinate them is just not effective. Like in the examples I gave, these other subtle methods were just not effective. They weren't working. So if they have a situation where the subtle methods would work, why wouldn't they use them? Right, is the point. Before they go to out and out, just shooting someone down in the streets. So let's talk about some of the examples here, right? Like you see here, the picture on the left-hand side is Kwame Nkrumah in Conakry, swimming in the Gulf of Guinea, right outside where he lived, via Sealy, where he was there with the Democratic Party of Guinea and Secretary after his government in Ghana was overthrown on February 24th, 1966. This man ate in a very healthy manner, got up every morning and exercised. There are tons of witnesses who verify this. And he would swim in the Gulf of Guinea. He'd swim there in the ocean. So he was very fit. He had at the time he went to Guinea Conakry. He had no health issues. The picture next to him is France Fanon speaking at the All African People's Conference in Ghana when Nkrumah was still president in Ghana in December of 1958. And at that conference, Fanon is pretty much single handedly credited with turning the culture and the environment of that conference from one of nonviolent, we need to get independence through negotiation, to one of we need to get independence any way we can by any means necessary, and that using violence against our oppressors is our right as human beings. This was what Fanon's speech entail. And so, if you think about them, right, of course, imperialism works overtime to cover their tracks, right? So we're not able to say absolutely that Nkrumah and Fanon were assassinated. We can't say that. But we do want to have this discussion. We think that we have every right to have this discussion. So we will say that we can raise questions about what happened to them. And we'll say that Nkrumah was, of course, viciously removed from Ghana February 24th, 1966, and he went to Guinea. And he lived that healthy, conscious life in Guinea as a co-president there with Sekou Touré. And as I just mentioned, he exercised daily, he ate well, he was physically fit. He had a personal chef that was assigned to him. Because you have to understand that imperialism made constant efforts to overthrow the Democratic Party of Guinea. They were trying to get rid of all of the revolutionary governments in Africa. They had successfully sabotaged Lumumba's efforts and the National Congolese movement in the Congo in 1961. So next, they focused their attention on Nkrumah, who they learned from what happened in the Congo that Nkrumah was going to be a problem to anything they tried to do in Africa. So they knew after all of Nkrumah's efforts to thwart their sabotage of Lumumba's government in the Congo, they knew they had to get rid of Nkrumah. So they went to work on him. And once they successfully were able to overthrow Nkrumah in 1966, then they were working on ratcheting up their efforts in Guinea against the Democratic Party of Guinea and Sekou Touré. And they continued those efforts until Sekou Touré's death in 1984, which we'll talk about a little more about in a minute. But of course, the other government that they were focused on was two other governments at that time was the government in Mali under Keita, Modibo Keita. Of course, they overthrew his government in 1968, and then the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. But unfortunately, Nasser himself unexpectedly died in 1970, and that's something that we need to look closer at and raise questions about. But Nkrumah in Guinea was fit and had a personal chef. And if you look at the dates, in 1969, 70, 71, if you look at that period of time, you'll find that there's a correlation between when Nkrumah's personal chef mysteriously died, right? We still don't know why the chef died. And then that person was replaced with someone else who was not um, as well known to Nkrumah's political circle. And of course, at that time, the conditions in Guinea were so desperate, they did. I'm sure that the Democratic Party of Guinea did the best they could to protect Nkrumah, but there was constant sabotage. And Nkrumah wrote a lot about that. There was constant sabotage. There was no clear understanding of who to trust during those years in Guinea. There were constant efforts to assassinate Sekou Touré and overthrow his government. And so in this environment, this unknown person was made Nkrumah's chef after his chef mysteriously died suddenly. And then not too long after that, his health took a serious turn for the worse, culminating with him allegedly dying of prostate cancer in April of 1972 in a Romanian hospital in Eastern Europe. He wasn't even able to end his life at home in Africa. And so this is at the very least suspicious, right? And at the very best, it was an out and out attempt to assassinate President Kwame Nkrumah. That's what we're saying about that. And now that we put that out there, it's up to you to take it from there and do more research. We all should be researching these things so that we can provide our people with the proper information to understand the conditions under which we live, right? That's why we put it out there. You can't say after hearing that, well, there's no reason to talk about that. There's a lot of reason to talk about that. And then we moved to Frantz Fanon. He was only 36 years old when he had an attempt against his life in Algeria. He was working in support of the Algerian Revolution in the early 1960s after he moved there from growing up in the Caribbean, Martinique in the Caribbean, great example of Pan-Africanism, like Kwame Ture, left the Caribbean, moved to Africa, and contributed to the African Revolution, the Pan-African Revolution. But Fanon, just a few short months after there was a clear attempt on his life in Algeria, he suddenly developed leukemia. He had no previous health issues, nothing that would indicate that this is something that could happen. And once he was diagnosed with like leukemia, he died very shortly after that at 36 years old. So again, at the very least, this is very suspicious, right? At best, again, this was an effort to end this man's life because of his contribution to the struggle. He was arguing and articulating that these negotiations with these colonial regimes were not the best method that we should use to gain our freedom. He had made a very close friendship with Patrice Lumumba at the All African People's Conference in Ghana in December of 1958. And he talked to Lumumba, I'm sorry, about this constantly up until the point that um, the two of them would lose their lives, Lumumba and Fanon. And of course, if you know the history, Lumumba's first real notice from imperialism came when he abruptly stood up at the Congolese independence ceremony in June of 1960 and lambasted the king of Belgium, who was there and was uplifting the work of Leopold in the Congo, who killed millions of our people in the Congo and terrorized the Congo to get the ivory. And Patrice Lumumba stood up and told this white man and everybody there that he was out of his damn mind. And this is when imperialism first took notice of him. And Fanon would tell Lumumba, like, you need to be careful because these people, you're negotiating this independence from them, and power concedes nothing without a demand. So these are questions when we talk about Nkrumah and Fanon that we definitely need to think about. And then just more food for thought, right? Secretary, had of course long been a thorn in the side of imperialism from the 1950s through the 1970s. He was, a constant target of imperialism to get rid of them. And then as Guinea's economic capacity began to experience some instability, Touré and the Democratic Party of Guinea had to begin in the early 1980s to really do something they hadn't really done, which was negotiate with the capitalist world for international trade relationships out of necessity. Because what imperialism does is they starve revolutions out. This is what happened to Guinea. They imposed these sanctions, these underground sanctions, and it's impossible for these countries to get rice at a reasonable price, to get grain at a reasonable price, to get spare parts at a reasonable price. This is what they've been doing to Cuba now for 63 years, right? So, or 60 years rather. So this is what they did to Guinea. And so they began to start trying to negotiate from a position of dignity around the question of capitalism's desire to get close to the bauxite reserves there in Guinea, and to negotiate around this. These talks began to slow down in early 1984. Like imperialism was not getting the type of cooperation from Secretary and the Democratic Party of Guinea that they wanted in early 1984. And shortly after their talks concluded in January, February 1984, Touré suddenly came down with what was called a heart attack while visiting Saudi Arabia. And after being flown to Cleveland, Ohio, here in the United States of America, he died on the operating table having open heart surgery. And again, this is, at best suspicious. Okay. At worst, it was an effort to assassinate this man and move him out the way. And once he was dead, they were able to have the unfettered access to Guinean bauxite, which is used to make, bauxite is used to make plastic, right? Aluminum, rather, aluminum uh, products. And so they were able to get that, which they continue to have access to this day, while the people of Guinea have nothing. And what Secretary and the Democratic Party of Guinea were struggling to do is use that bauxite to serve the interests of the people. He was called a dictator, but he didn't. There's no evidence that he used any of that bauxite wealth to enrich himself, not even a nickel. So if he was a dictator, he was the dumbest dictator ever. He didn't do anything to benefit himself. Everything he was doing was trying to benefit the people of Guinea, the people of Africa, the people of Africa all over the African world, inside and outside of Africa. So suspicious, highly suspicious. And then Kwame Ture. Kwame Ture talked often about imperialism's chemical warfare, right? It's well documented the chemical warfare they employed against Fidel Castro in Cuba. Over 600 documented attempts, many more than that, to kill Castro, slipping him poison cigars, food, etc. There were similar efforts made against Patrice Lumumba to poison him before that. The subtle efforts were made before the violent assassination, right? They made several efforts to subtly assassinate Fidel Castro before they made several violent efforts to assassinate. None of those, fortunately, were successful, right? We talked about the poisoning of Malcolm X in Egypt. Kwame Ture talked about all of this, right? All the time. And in 1996, Kwame developed prostate cancer, and despite receiving extensive treatment in Cuba and Libya, his conditions worsened all the way to his final breath. Kwame said loudly that the CIA gave me cancer. In fact, there was a banner at his life ceremony in Guinea Conakry in November 1998 in French that said that the CIA gave me cancer. Now, the CIA, the FBI, the CIA, they had targeted Kwame Ture for decades. And I think one of the main reasons why he decided to move to Guinea is because he understood that, like, he was in grave danger staying here in the US. And then not only that, but obviously from a political standpoint, his evolving Pan-African consciousness, of course, led him to do what it should have done, send him home to Africa and to do the work from Africa. Like, people here are so confused. They think, someone said to me the other day, well, if you move to Africa, you're running from the struggle. Like, imperialism's propaganda has convinced these people that everything in the world centers on the US. Everything centers on the US. Like, think about how stupid that is to make a statement like that. Like, you're more in the center of the struggle in Africa than you are here. Way more in the center. This isn't the center of anything except imperialism. But that's how they have people thinking. Like, if you want to do anything, you have to do it from the US or Europe. US and Europe don't offer anything. The resources are at home in Africa. That's the prize. There's nothing here. There's no bauxite here. There's no cobalt here. There's no oil here. There isn't hardly any good oxygen here. So that's, again, at best suspicious, at worst, Kwame Ture was assassinated by imperialism. The cancer was inflicted upon him, as he said often, by the CIA to take his life and remove his voice from the struggle for revolutionary Pan-Africanism. But the good thing about this is the best lesson that we can learn from Kwame Ture is the work that he did, right? His work was never about, like, this man was the face of the African struggle for human rights and forward progress in the late 1960s in this country. There was no face that, after the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, by mid 1968, there was not a single African face in this country that was more respected as a leader for our struggle in this country than Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael back then. That statement is irrefutable. That's why when the Black Panther Party wanted to draft him as a minister into the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver, who did and said a lot of wild things, but one thing he said at that time that was absolutely correct when asked why they wanted the then Stokely Carmichael to be a leader in the Black Panther Party, Eldridge said he's the most loved Black man in America. And so this is irrefutable. And the reason why that's important is because Kwame wasn't interested in having a title as the leader. He wasn't interested in, all of his political contemporaries, whether you're talking about Jesse Jackson, whether you're talking about Andrew Young, all the people that he struggled in the movement with during the 60s. John Lewis, all these people went on to become mayors of big cities. They went on to become governors. They went on to become senators, or not senators, but legislators on the national level. They went on to do those things. You don't think Kwame could have did that if he wanted to? If that was his political objective, you don't think he could have? He would have beat all of them. He was more respected than all of them. I'm not putting any of them down. That's just a fact. He put his life on the line more than, they love to talk about John Lewis, and John Lewis put his life on the line. No question about that. But he didn't do it any more than Kwame Ture did it. He wasn't out doing the projects that Kwame Ture was that put his life constantly on the line. He wasn't doing that. He had the Edmund Pettus where they beat him, and I respect him for that. But I'm just saying, Kwame could have been any of those things. But he wasn't interested in that. He was only interested, in his own words, in the power of the organized masses. And so his work to build revolutionary cadre, knowing he wouldn't live forever, and that the best work he could do was to build people to replace him. Not one person, not two people, but thousands, millions of people to replace him. That was Kwame Ture's work. And so he's been dead since November 15th of 1998. And here today, all these years later, almost 30 years later, there are revolutionary Pan-Africanist cadre with the vision that Kwame Ture provided to us all over the world. I'm one of them. And so you could, in Fred Hampton's word, you could wipe out the revolutionary, whether you do it covertly or overtly. You can kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. And I think the greatest error they made with Kwame Ture is they didn't understand that. They thought that if they got rid of him and got rid of all these other people, that would stop the work. And they don't understand revolutionary cadre and mass leadership. And the fact that they don't understand that, one day soon is going to be their downfall. And so we want to thank you for joining us. We want to invite you to come back next week. We have a very interesting program for you next week, September 7th. It's going to be what happened in Libya since Gaddafi. In 2011, Barack Obama's regime led the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to obliterate the Libyan Jamahiriya. Before that happened, Libya was the shining light in Africa. It was the safest place in Africa. They provided resources all over the African continent, all over the world, even. And they were helping to bring about stability all throughout Africa. And then NATO bombed them into submission. Muammar Gaddafi was captured and killed. And since that time, Libya is now the most dangerous place in Africa. So we're going to talk about that, right? And we want to invite you, the QR code in the upper left-hand corner, the red and white one, to scan that, and you can get information about all of these online programs that we host. So we encourage you to do that. And then we also, you can get information on our Forward Ever shop, where you can get hoodies and t-shirts that represent messages supporting the African Revolution. So you should do that. The proceeds go towards our work at home on the African continent. You can also find information about Hood Communists there.org, Revolutionary Pan-African blog. So you definitely want to check that out. And for those of you in Northern California, we want to again invite you every Thursday night from 6 to 8 p.m. here in Sacramento. We have community self-defense, where we train people in how to take care of their community when there's a physical threat. And that's at 2775 Cottage Way, Unit 15. You don't have to sign up. You don't just come. and be prepared to do some work. And we hope to see you on Thursday. And then on Monday, September 15th, here in Sacramento, we have a program, Best Practices for Traveling to Africa. If you are thinking you want to go to Africa, and you should, we're going to be giving you all the information you need to do that. And that's going to be also from 6 to 8 p.m. on Monday, September 15th at the Shakur Center, 3230 Broadway, 3230 Broadway here in Sacramento. You don't have to sign up or just come through. Come through. We always have snack food, and we'll get you started with knowing what you need to know to go to Africa. So come on through. You don't have to pay anything for any of this stuff. All you have to do is be willing to participate. So why you don't do it, I wouldn't know. The bottom QR code on the right-hand side is for you to become a monthly sponsor to our on-the-ground work in the Sahel region of Africa, in Burkina Faso and Niger through Burkina Books. We're bringing revolutionary literature, politicizing our people for the African Revolution. So please become a monthly sponsor, contribute as much as you can each month, and make that contribution. And then in the upper right, my book, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence, A Guide for Organizing Defense Against White Supremacist, Patriarchal, and Fascist Violence. It's only $8 US. Unfortunately, it's only available on Amazon, but we use the master's tools to dismantle the master system. So 100, first off, it's a great organizing book, if I can say so myself. And I'm not the only one saying that. A whole bunch of people have said that. Black Agenda Reports has said it. The Hampton Institute has said it. A whole bunch of people have said it. So you can check it out yourself. But it's a great organizing book. But also, it 100% of the proceeds go towards our anti-fascist work here, which we're doing a lot of that. And we need supplies. We need supplies for our community self-defense training. So when you buy books, it helps us. So we encourage people. I encourage you, get books, get study groups, read it, buy the books, and we can get these pads, and we can help contribute to preparing our communities to do the necessary work so that we can be free, y'all. So we thank you for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your day. Forward ever, backwards never.